thank Jodie for her speech and call Laura to the floor to continue the negative things case.
Ladies and gentlemen, the biggest problem with the opposition's case today is that they are failing to recognise that the kind of activities that they are making punishable and illegal are activities carried out by businesses that were legal at that time. I think like the biggest problem with the opposition's case, which they have failed to engage with, is this principle of the rule of law, that you are fundamentally changing the way the businesses behave. You are punishing them for doing something which was technically legal by the tax code at that time. And that is fundamentally harmful to the rule of law, that is fundamentally harmful for businesses, it is fundamentally harmful for tax reform. 4 questions in rebuttal. Firstly, what will this model do for tax evasion? Secondly, what will it do for resources at the tax office? Thirdly, how will businesses respond, and what will this mean in terms of court cases? Fourthly, what will this mean for rich people blocking tax reform? First question, what will this do for tax evasion? And what we heard from the affirmative team is what this model does is increases the burden on companies to prove that they aren't engaging in tax evasion. Here's the problem. When a corporation knows that in the process of doing its tax return, that if it does something legally, that later down the track they could be punished for that, what that actually does is encourages corporations to have more perverse incentives to hide the kind of things that they're doing in their tax reports. So things like tax evasion is less likely to be detected in the first place because we think that corporations still have a reason to not disclose everything that they have to the tax office. They still have a capacity to be selective in what they disclose to the tax office. We think that means the tax office will have less of a capacity to detect that tax evasion in the first place because corporations will be engaging in more secrecy around their tax processes, like Richard explained to you at first. So we think that like because companies will still be able to choose exactly what information it is that they're releasing, we think that like what will happen under the affirmative team model is those corporations just won't release all of their documents. Why? Because we think that like when they know that they could be punished later down the track and they don't know what it is that they will be punished for, we think like that gives them a huge incentive not to be honest. It gives them a much bigger incentive to hide their practices compared to the status quo because we think that they know that they could be pinged for just about anything. Richard explained to you about how tax law is necessarily complex. Tax law necessarily has loopholes and it is difficult to distinguish between what is a loophole and what is not. But like we have not heard enough engagement from the affirmative team about why that's not the case. Like all we heard from them is like, we will make a simple tax code. Ladies and gentlemen, like we would love to see that because we just don't think it's possible to have a simple tax code with no loopholes. And like by the very definition of tax law, it is complex. It does have different and competing circumstances and we think that like the Act cannot just rely on the fact that they would like to have a simple tax code to be able to achieve those benefits. We think it will absolutely make secrecy worse. I think that means you have less capacity to detect tax evasion. We think like under our model, companies do not have that same perverse incentive. I think like companies are more likely to cooperate because you are not punishing them for engaging in legal activity. That's why we win that issue. Second question, what will this do for resources? What we heard from the affirmative teams, like this means the tax office will be able to collect more money from corporations and build up their resources that way. Why is that not true? Firstly, we think that like retrospective laws give tax officers a perverse incentive to change laws in such a way that they can profit from that. We think like what that means is your tax laws are not necessarily fair or necessarily helpful. We think what it means is they become arbitrary to ensure that the tax office can maximize its tax collection. We think that is a huge problem. But also we think that like even if that was not the case, like we still dispute that the tax office is going to end up with more money in the long run because we've had no mechanism from the affirmative team about how tax evasion will be better detected in the first place. Like we think that like when you're going through a court case, it is possible in some instances that tax evasion may be detected, but we do not think that is a benefit that they can stand for across the board. It is not a benefit that they have under their model compared to ours. Third question, how will businesses respond to this and what will it do for court cases? What we heard from the affirmative team is like this will simplify it because corporations will just receive a bill that they will have to pay. Rubbish, ladies and gentlemen. If you're a corporation who does something legally and you receive a bill for something you did which was technically legal under the tax code, you're far more likely to mount a huge legal defense against that. You are far more likely to engage in bigger challenges. Things like that is actually going to block up the resources of the court even more than the opposition wanted to talk to you about. They wanted you to believe that this will reduce the strain on the tax system or will reduce long court cases. We absolutely think this will magnify all of those problems because we think in previous cases where corporations may have been more willing to cooperate, I think because you are punishing them now and labelling them as committing illegal activity. We think that is a hostile gesture which will cause them to create longer and more drawn out court processes. So we think that will actually be a huge problem. But we also think that companies will still have an incentive to be using loopholes in the first place. I think there is a commercial reason why corporations don't want to pay as much tax as they have to. No reason from the affirmative team why that's going to change. But then we also think that the tax office is not going to have the capacity to be able to fight all of these court cases in the first place. We think they will have less resources to be able to do that efficiently when you are changing the behaviours the corporations have used when you are making those things that are legal illegal. We think that means the tax office will be facing far more claims and far bigger claims with better lawyers and bigger cases. And we think that that's what will strain the tax office, not what is probably going to have illegal and massive ramifications for important stakeholders and important lobbyists. So we think we've got tax reform in that way. So, continuing, why do we think that this is going to be fundamentally harmful for tax reform and getting better tax laws? We think under the status quo, we think that businesses do things legally. We think yes, we can see that they do use loopholes, but we think that those loopholes are legal. We think they are technically within the confines of the law. But really importantly, as Richard made clear to you, that it's not always clear when something is a loophole and when something is not. So we think that what will happen under the opposition's model is that we think we'll increase the incentive of businesses to block those kind of reforms. Why? We think that firstly, businesses' reputations are on the line if they've engaged in a practice that was initially legal and they are then later labelled as committing criminal or illegal activity, and that's not what they did at the time. I think that businesses will have a fundamental incentive to avoid that kind of labelling, seeing as they engage in nothing technically wrong in the first place. But we also think businesses don't want to face that kind of financial punishment for something that they've done legally. So we think that gives them an incentive, one, to be secretive about their practices, but two, to restrict tax reform. How do we think this will happen? Like the affirmative team conceded in the second speaker's speech, we think the corporations have huge amounts of lobbying power. We think that they have a massive capacity to affect the way the tax laws are determined. We think that doesn't change under the affirmative model. What does change is it means that when there is political discussion about changing and reforming and improving tax laws, I think the corporations are more likely to block those reforms. I think what that means is that tax law cannot be progressive. I think that tax law stagnates. That is fundamentally harmful all stakeholders in this debate. We think that businesses need to be able to operate in a framework that is predictable and reliable, and the affirmative team absolutely derails that. So because we are proud to stand for the rule of law, we are proud to stand for fair practices in tax law. I am very proud to oppose.